It's so nice having so many people in the front finally, right? I love it. I will make just a brief note that the gospel is replete with so much about what the Lord is doing and how, in a particular way, the Lord really reacts against the poor being disadvantaged. So there's a lot in there, and it's a confusing gospel, and I realize that. But I'm not going to talk about that. If you have questions, you can ask me, whatever, send me an email. But I'm not going to talk about that today. I want to first talk about one of my favorite movies of all time. Is this movie I hope a lot of you have seen. It's called Shawshank Redemption. Now, it's not a lighthearted movie if you're looking for something to do tonight. It's like, oh, let's watch that movie Father Matt said. It's like putting on the Brady Bunch. No, it's a heavy movie, right? It's a movie about this guy who gets put in prison, of which he says he's innocent. I'm not ruining the story. Go ahead and watch it for yourselves. But it's a really great movie. And in a particular scene, one of these lifers in prison, this guy named Brooks, serving a 50-year sentence in prison, at age 73, is, against really his own will, is released from prison. It's not something that he wants. It's not something that he desires. He really wants to stay there, has found a home there. And this guy, Brooks, he gets released, right? He gets released and he gets a job working at a grocery store. He gets placed in this halfway house to try to get his life set on the right footing. It's not really going well for him. He has trouble sleeping at night, and he just lives in this constant and perpetual fear. And by the end of his term, he's kind of very much so just a gentle-natured man. And you really just feel for him as you're watching this happen to him in the movie. And he has this fear that he just lives with that's perpetual. And he just desires to break his parole, that he could just go back home to prison, as he says. But instead, in great sadness, with just his vigor for life just completely sapped, he decides to sadly end his life. Now, this scene reveals something key about human nature, that you can certainly be released from bondage, from a particular situation that binds you and weighs you down, but that in no way does it at all mean that you're free. Removing the exterior cause of what binds you, whether it's a job, somebody who annoys you, which is probably me for a lot of you, whatever it may be, or the removal of that doesn't necessarily make you free. It in no way ensures that you are going to attain your freedom. Why is that? Because freedom isn't necessarily the ability to do what I would like. Now, the Israelites show this well. Now, they had been slaves in the desert for 400 years, and we hear today the 10 Commandments. And God gives those to Moses on Mount Sinai. But what immediately precedes that is them miraculously getting released from Egypt, going through the Red Sea. They have this great celebration. Everyone's happy, happy, happy. And then they get to Mount Sinai. And then they get the code. They get the 10 Commandments, right? So they're free. Nobody's telling them they have to work, right? Nobody's telling them that. For 400 years, the Israelites had to work for 7 days a week. Nobody's telling them to work, but that's naturally what they're doing, right? They have to be taught that they don't have to work, that they no longer have to be oppressed by that, okay? So it's not necessarily something, freedom isn't intuitive to them. It's something that's much more than that. Freedom is not the ability to simply do what I would like, because we can still choose to do something that oppresses us. Rather, freedom is the ability to do what I ought. It is the ability to choose the good, what I should choose. Thus, and this is very key, because if freedom is not simply the ability to just exercise our will, but is doing what I ought, then God has to teach us how to be free. It's something that he has to show us. And God does this in a couple of main ways. The first, most obvious way is what's called the natural law. Now, the church teaches that natural law expresses the original, kind of intuitive moral sense, which enables man to discern good and evil, the truth and a lie. Nobody likes getting lied to. We may lie ourselves, but nobody likes when it's done to them. We have an intuitive sense that we don't like to be lied to. Nobody has to teach us that. All of us, too, agree that we should do good and avoid evil. We may disagree what that looks like. We might think we could do just good for ourselves, but nobody here disagrees with the fact that we should do good and avoid evil. This is what's called the natural law that we all have. Anyone who doesn't have this is clinically crazy, really. It's the one thing that gives a sense of human decency. It tells me that I can't just punch the face of somebody who I disagree with. I can't. I'd be nice, but I can't do it, right? The natural law is telling me that I can't do something like that, right? But the natural law is not all. And the church teaches that the natural law is not perceived by everyone in the same way. Original sin, as we well know, comes into the world, and the natural law is not universally applied by everyone in the same way. Now, many of us have maybe heard perhaps somebody saying to us about our faith, that could be your truth, right? But this is my truth, right? You can believe that, right? But this is my truth. And for things that are objectively true across the board for everyone, whether we like it or not, that's a problem, right? We have to be able to say that some things are true, whether we believe them or not. And the brokenness of our society displays that we need God to reveal how we should live, to build on natural law's foundation. So often, our attraction to sin blinds our freedom and skews the natural law. We need God to reveal how to live. Thankfully, God has done so. Here's what he does. As we were saying, original sin reveals that the law needs to be retaught, right? Lucky Adam and Eve had an intuitive sense of what God wanted. They didn't have to be taught. Yet they chose sin, and that breaks the relationship with God. The sense of what God wants is not naturally known intuitively anymore. So what does God do? He spends this whole thousands and thousands of year period called salvation history where he reteaches us. And this is crazy, right? God reveals and teaches his law through the 10 Commandments. That's really one of the first definitive moments in the Old Testament where God reveals what he wants in a very systematized way, if you will, right? And this law isn't meant to bind us, but to free us, right? Now, how is that the case? Because God doesn't really want Christian life to simply just be commandment following and sin management. I think so often we can think that it's the case, right? We have our Catholic guilt that tells us not to do things. No, it's more than that, I promise you. But rather, his end goal is for the law to be interior to us and to give us that sense of joy when we do what God wants us to do, right? The psalm so beautifully sung today speaks of this reality. The law of the God refreshes the soul. It rejoices the heart. Isn't that great? Christ fulfills this interior sense of the law in the New Testament. When we're baptized, something amazing happens. God places that law, which once was exterior in the 10 Commandments, into our hearts. And he gives us joy in following it if we allow him to do so. Only if we are obedient to it. If we're in a state of sin, for example, if we neglect going to confession, we block ourselves from receiving the joy of the law that God so desires us to live by, the way that we're meant to live. So, if you're going to confession and you're avoiding going to confession, come back. There's no greater joy than coming back to that. But nonetheless, the bottom line is that if we set our sight on living the way that God means for us, we're in a state of grace, no sin on our soul. We allow our baptism to take effect, and the law will cease becoming burdensome, but life-giving. That may not sound like our experience. And we may recognize that the law may not be met with the great sweetness that our psalm speaks of. It can seem like it's burdensome, right? Now, this has nothing to do with something wrong with the law itself, but with our perception of it so often. Here's what Satan tries to do. Now, we may think more or less that we live God's law, but we could believe that other people could, for example, live the way that they want to, and that could be true, all right? Now, eventually, this way of thinking, if we think people can have their truth, I have mine, but they have theirs. This way of thinking eventually gets us to kind of think, if they can have their truth, so can I have mine, right? And it kind of allows us, if we disagree with something, to lead us to believe, that doesn't have to be true for me. I can choose what beliefs that are given to me to follow and just reject the ones I don't want to. Yet this means that the lawgiver is not ourselves, or not God, but ourselves, right? Now, God could give the law, but at the end of the day, the reason that we say something is true is if we believe with it or not the fact that God gives it to us, which means that it's not universally true. We could say we agree with most of what God says, but at the end of the day, If a law is true only because I say it's true, you have all these people that say the same thing. How do we know what's true, right? That means, like, let's say part of my moral code is to slash everyone's tire, right? And you're like, that'd be great. Yeah, I could do that. It's great. Or steal stuff. Right? I could do that, make a lot of money that way. But you could say, well, no, that isn't true. I'm like, no, wait, this is my truth, right? My moral code says I can slash everyone's tires, right? I'm going to do that, right? And it's hard to say that something isn't true based on the fact that one person believes in it, right? It's hard if there's nothing objective, right? If everyone is right in their own way, then nothing is true, right? If we follow our own way, then nothing is true. There's a priest who makes this point that in hell, everyone's favorite song is Frank Sinatra's My Way. They're just screaming it at the top of their lungs. I did it my way. And they love it. They sing it all day. Now I know, it's hard. It's hard to accept that a few of our concepts of reality might need to be changed. It's hard. It's hard to admit that sometimes we don't know what's best for us. It's hard to admit that, especially when it's those whom we love, right? When somebody we know goes astray. It's very difficult. Yet the law is not true only because God himself made it so, but because it corresponds with the way that God made us to live. Now, if we strive to follow it, we will not be bound. We will be free. Today we have the great joy, as I was saying at the beginning of Mass, to have the RCIA candidates who will be brought into full communion with the church. Right? They will be receiving the creed today. That is what they'll be doing today. Now that's something so often, we say it every Sunday Mass, something we take for granted. But it is no small thing. There is great freedom in what all of you will do today. Thanks be to God for that. Now, in a particular way, today they are willing to stake their life on the reality that God and his church are true. Today you state that you're no longer bound by the burden of living for yourselves, but by the freedom of living for God and his church. How great is that? Today your lives can never be the same. In proclaiming the creed, the way you live and act must be for God and his church. What freedom it is to receive that today, to live the way that we are all meant to live. Today we ask for the grace to follow God's law because it makes us free. We were meant to live for no other way.